Okay, so Tavis right here thinks that water is not wet. Now, I think it is wet. So we've been having this conversation, but we're gonna start it over, and we're videoing it. Okay, we're videoing it, and I'm just gonna leave the recording going, and we're gonna argue. So here you go.
No, I wanted to
So
show us.
what is your point then? Okay, what is your point?
Water isn't wet because
That's not a, oh my gosh.
if something's wet, then that means that the wetness can be removed. It can be in a state of either. I don't want to talk to the camera. I want to talk to you.
Okay, talk to me.
It can be, if something is wet, it can be in a state of wet or in a state of dry, right?
Mm-hmm.
For something to be able
So
to
then
be,
is water dry?
for
If it's
something-
wet or
wait,
dry,
wait.
is it
For
dry?
something to be able to be considered wet, it needs to be able to be in a state of dry or be in a state of wet.
Yeah, exactly. Is water dry then? If it's
Well,
not wet, then it has to be wet or
No,
dry.
I'm saying
You just said
no.
it
I'm
has
saying
to. Oh,
I'm saying if water's wet, that means it can also be dry, right?
no,
so-
water can't be dry. It's
Yeah,
water.
exactly. Therefore, it's not wet. Because
What?
for something to be able to be wet,
Do you agree that something is either wet or dry? There's no either, or there's no not wet or dry. It can't.
I think that
It has to be one of the
I
two.
think something can be wet or dry. Like if I had a table and it had no water on it, it would be dry. Then I put water on it, it's wet.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you put water on water, it's just more water. And if you wipe up
Which
water,
is wet.
It's
Because if you put water on water, water makes things wet. So water on top of the water, hypothetically, makes it wet. If we're talking by what you're saying.
if that were valid, then you would be able to wipe off the water that you added, which you couldn't do.
Okay, we're gonna go back to your point before. It wasn't on the video yet, so this is your point about the fire. Just say it real quick.
So like, if water makes things wet, right? And fire burns things. And fire isn't in and of itself burning. Therefore, water isn't in and of itself wet.
Fire is burning though, because it's
Fire isn't burning.
Yes, it
because
is.
For something to be burning or in the process of burning, then
It's
it
not
will,
burning itself, because otherwise it would keep building up and be infinitely large.
Well, then what is it burning?
It's burning the fuel, the wood or whatever you're burning.
Well then water isn't wet. Whatever it's on is wet then.
No.
Yeah, well then if fire...
Okay, if we're doing elements here, like the elements of the earth, what about wind?
No, that's stupid because that wind...
That's your same point.
Wind doesn't do
Wind,
anything.
water, fire, those are all kind of the same category. Is wind wet or dry?
Obviously,
going back to
it
this.
depends on the humidity.
Okay, well, let's assume it's a nice sunny day. Is it wet or dry?
I don't know.
Yes, you
Dry,
do.
I think so.
Dry, right?
Yeah.
Now, we can agree it's either wet or dry. There's no not wet or dry, right?
It can be wet if it gets humid.
I know, I'm saying something is either wet or dry. There's no anything else. There's one of the two.
Well,
Right?
nothing can be both wet
Yes or no?
and dry.
Yes or no?
Yes or no what?
It's either wet or dry. There's no in between and there's no anything else, wet or dry.
That's a black and white fallacy.
What?
It means you're giving me, like, something...
To
here.
prove a point.
Something
That's what
can
you
either
just
be
did.
this or be that.
It's true though. What else can it be then? Wet or dry?
What, wind?
No, anything.
Well, nothing. Okay, what I'm saying is that nothing can be wet and dry at the same time, unless it's like a table and it's got some water on it. Then that portion of the table is wet, and and the other portion is dry, right? But like, let's say a towel that was submerged in water.
It's
that's
wet.
Yeah,
The towel's wet.
but it could also be dry if I just wring it out. So what I'm
Well,
saying
yeah,
is that
after it
something-
dries.
What I'm saying is that in order for something to be able to be considered wet, it needs to be able to get in a state of wet and dry, but you can't have water in a state of dry.
Okay, hold on. Okay. So he says for something to be considered wet, it has to be wet or dry.
No, for something to be able to be considered wet, it has to be able to be in a state of wet or dry. Like if something can't get dry, like if something is only wet, then it's not wet. That's just its permanent state, and it's not wet. It's just a liquid.
But it's not permanent because things dry over time, right?
Yeah, but the water. Yeah, but we're not talking about the things. We're talking about the water itself.
Okay, the water evaporates, so the water will dry.
That doesn't mean the water dries.
It doesn't dry. The molecules go up, and
Yeah, so water.
and then it rains.
So that means that water can't dry, and since it
you're
can't
right.
dry,
It can't dry, which wet.
means it can't get wet.
No, it's either one of the two. You just said that. It
No,
can't. It's
I
not.
said it has to be able to be one or the two for it to be able to be considered wet or dry. Because let's say if something were, I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now, but if something could never get wet, right, then it wouldn't be considered dry, because then if that's just its permanent state. So it's not really dry because, well, that's kind of hard to
Okay,
explain.
well, back to the wind thing. If wind is wet, we'll assume it's humid. Does that mean the air has water molecules in it, right?
Probably.
So the wind is wet, we'll call it, wet or dry, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's humid, but we're going to call it wet because it's wet or dry, right?
Okay.
So when it's humid, you can feel the water on your skin when it's,
It's cold.
well, not just cold, but like if it's foggy maybe, or
Yeah.
something like that, you feel the water. I don't really know where I'm going with this
I was
one,
gonna
but
say, what's your point?
well, okay, scrap that. So the wind is dry, we'll
Yeah.
assume. So it makes things dry because it is dry. Water makes things wet because it is wet.
Yeah, but that's different because wind.
That's comparing your same thing about the fire. You said
No, because fire.
you said fire isn't burned and water isn't wet.
Yeah, but wind. Okay,
But
so
wind
the
is
thing
dry
is that water
and makes things dry, and water is wet and makes things wet.
Yeah, but the thing is that water can only be wet and fire can only be dry. Wind can be both wet and
Fire,
dry. Fire can't be wet or it'll not be there.
well,
And
not
water,
necessarily, but
yeah.
well,
And you can't make.
there are some liquids that burn.
Well,
but-
that's
Yeah, okay.
like because wind shouldn't even be included in this debate because wind.
Why not?
Can
If
be-
you're including fire, wind should be.
No, just because they're elements, that's.
Well, you used
correlation
fire,
causation.
so
Well, yeah, but that's because fire can't be wet. Fire can't be wet. Water can't be dry, but wind can be both wet and dry. So if you're gonna use wind, why not just use a table or like a freaking dog's paw?
okay.
Because-
Well, a dog's paw, let's say, could make things dry over time, but really that's just evaporation, right? Wind.
Dog waves his paw over a puddle, it just evaporates.
Well, no, I mean over time. The dog isn't really doing it, is what I'm saying. But wind uses cooling convection or whatever it's called. I don't remember. To like, if something gets like a hair dryer, if your hair is wet after you take a shower and use a hair dryer, it's to dry it off faster, right?
Mhm.
So the wind dries things, correct? Or air moving faster dries things. Not necessarily wind outside, but
It technically just speeds up the process of drying
yes, that's what I
things.
just said, except you said it a little differently.
Okay.
So wind makes things dry, we'll conclude, right? Wind is dry and makes things dry, correct?
Yes, correct, but wind.
But nothing, correct or what?
I said yes, but wind isn't the only thing that can make things dry. Whereas
Yeah.
water is the only thing that can make
What else
things
can
wet.
make things dry? Name one.
Fire, and a towel. If I just wipe
Okay.
off something that's wet.
Fire makes things dry with heat, right? Like if you have an ice cube and you set it outside and it's hot, it'll melt and then evaporate quicker. Heat speeds up the process, right?
Yes.
And so does wind blowing, speeds up the process. So that means fire is dry and makes things dry, we'll say, and wind is dry and makes things dry. Water is wet and makes things wet. Those all go together. Yes, they do.
Water isn't wet.
You can't just say that. You have to have an
And
argument.
fire isn't dry.
Why not?
Because
You literally said that earlier.
Well, I just.
I'm gonna put the clip right in this
Okay, cool.
of him saying fire is dry in slow motion. That'll be funny.
You're not gonna be able
Yeah, I
to
will.
figure out how to do that. I just forgot about what I said previously. So technically, fire's dry, but
You just said it again.
it's just so hard to explain. Like I know what I'm thinking, but okay. So what I said earlier, for something to be able to be considered wet or dry, it has to be able to be in both. It has to be able to be in both those states, not simultaneously, but it has to be able to convert from each state.
But water can't be dry.
Exactly. Therefore, it's not wet.
What? Water can't be dry, which
Okay,
means it is wet.
Think about it. Like
You're
this.
proving my point by saying that.
No, think about it like this. The definition of wet is covered or saturated with water, right?
Yeah, because water makes it wet.
No, so
If you're feeling, if you pour water on the table and you feel that water, it feels wet, right? Or
Yeah,
if you
it
put your
feels
hand
wet.
in a bucket of water, it feels wet on
yeah,
your
but then
hand.
the water isn't wet. Your hand's wet.
Why is your hand wet?
Why is your hand wet? Because
Yes.
the water got on your hand.
And what? Yeah, the water is on your hand, and you're feeling water, which feels.
Water feels wet,
Be-
but water
then
itself
what is it?
isn't wet.
Then is it dry?
No, it's not dry.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not saying.
Okay,
no,
I'm
no, no,
ending
no,
it.
no, no, no. You don't stop the video. You're doing black and white. You're saying that something.
Yes, it is
No,
black
no,
and
you're
white. There's
saying-
no.
No, you're saying something is either wet or it's either dry. There's
Yeah.
no in between, and that's not true.
What else is there?
In between, moist, damp. I don't know.
Okay, but
the
moist and damp are both wet.
water isn't wet. It gets things wet, but that doesn't mean it is
Oh
wet.
my.
Because water, first, okay, the definition of wet is something that's covered with water. Water can't be covered with water.
Yes,
'cause-
it can.
No, it just combines.
So then, is
if-
fire covered in fire if there's a big fire?
No, fire isn't covered in fire. It's just added
Yeah, it
onto the
is.
fire. No, it isn't.
Okay, then water covered in water is added onto the water.
Water is only wet if you pour oil on it, because the oil doesn't mix in with the water.
That's a whole different argument, but
No, that's the only way that water can be. If you put water on water, it's not wet. Because for something to be wet, that means it's covered or it has water on it. But water can't have water on it. Because then the water, it has water in it. And no, it doesn't even have water in it. It just makes more water. It's
water
just- it's
doesn't
water.
have water in it? Is that what you said?
No, I said it does have water in it.
What does?
Water. No, I'm saying.
Yeah, water molecules are oxygen and H2O. Or oxygen and hydrogen.
Yeah, so, okay, think about it like this. If you have oxygen and hydrogen,
Yes.
and you put it on, like, okay, so let's say you have one H2O, and then you put it on, I don't know, a carbon, then that's carbon with H2O on it. But then if
Okay.
you have one H2O, and then you put it on another H2O, that's two H2Os. That's not an H2O with an H2O.
Yeah, that's
on it.
that's double the water.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't.
mean-
So it's not on it. It's in it, meaning that it's not wet.
It's a part of itself.
Yeah,
If you,
exactly.
That's like a
because for
blob.
something-
That's like the blob monster connects to itself and makes a bigger one, right?
Yeah. For
So-
something to be wet, the water has to be on it, covered with water. Water can't be covered with water,
But
and water can't be saturated with water.
man,
I got you.
no, you didn't.
Yeah, water
That's
can't be
that's a
covered with
terrible
water.
argument.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
Mm-mm.
Water is covered with water because it
No, it
is
isn't.
water.
That's like saying.
That's oh my.
That's like saying.
This argument is just going in circles right now.
That's like saying a rock is covered with rock.
It is.
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
If you have a big rock and then you put a bunch of pebbles on it, then yeah. I
No, not like
guess.
that. That's different. That's stupid.
Yeah, but water, it can't be wet. Because it's like, unless the water for some reason is hydrophobic, then then it can't have water on it. The water just mixes in, just like how blood can't be wet because if
Yes,
you
it
put
can. Blood
if
is
you
a
put-
liquid.
If you put water,
Liquids are wet.
liquids aren't wet.
Oh my gosh.
They make things wet. That's like
No.
saying, wait, no, that's like saying
They make things wet because they are.
that's like saying that knives hurt because they make things hurt. Knives don't hurt.
No, that's not even close, because a knife is a little knife. It's a little object.
No, it's like, but the logic that you're using is that if something makes something something, then that something is that something. So like if water
In this case,
makes something
that doesn't
wet,
mean everything is that way.
well, it should mean if that,
No,
yeah.
you can't. Everything is not the same thing. You can't compare anything to anything just because that's part of the argument.
I don't even know what you just said.
You can't. Whatever.
Well, it's
Okay,
just
I'm
like-
done
no,
talking
no,
about
no,
this.
no.
Yeah, it's
Don't
over.
stop it yet.